going to be a very interesting talk about an extremely thought-provoking exhibition. But before we begin, I'd like to give you sort of brief biographies of our panellists. Mariele Neudecker was born in Germany, but studied at Goldsmiths and Chelsea Colleges of Art, and is currently a research fellow at Bath Spa University. Mariele was shortlisted for the highly competitive 4th plinth in Trafalgar Square, and has exhibited as far afield as Norway, Switzerland, Japan, Australia and Singapore, and there are more, I think. And in the UK has had solo exhibitions at many places, including Tate St Ives and Tate Britain. Mariele's work can be found in the Saatchi collection in London and in the Philip Morris collection in New York. She uses a broad range of media, including sculpture, installation, film and photography, to investigate the formation and historical dissemination of cultural constructs around the natural world, focusing particularly on landscape representations within the Northern European Romantic tradition and on today's notions of the sublime. Professor Anita Taylor is a practicing artist, exhibition organiser and writer, and is currently the Dean of Bath School of Art and Design at Bath Spa University. Anita studied at Gloucestershire College of Art and the Royal College of Art. She's held senior posts in higher education in the UK and in Australia since 2001. She was Director and CEO of the National Art School in Sydney, Australia from 2009 to 2013, Dean of Wimbledon College of Art from 2006 to 2009, and Vice Principal of Wimbledon School of Art from 2004 to 2006, prior to the merger with the University of the Arts London. During this time, she was also Director of the Centre for Drawing, which under her leadership became a university-wide research centre at the University of the Arts London. Anita has combined personal creativity with strategic and inspirational leadership to foster the special place of drawing in art practice. She's the founding director of the well-known Jerwood Drawing Prize project. The Jerwood Drawing Prize exhibition tours widely in the UK, and AUB has been extremely proud to host this in the past. Professor Susan Lambert is the curator of the Plastic Vanitas exhibition and is head of the University's Museum of Design in Plastics, which we call MODIP. Susan leads the Plastic Subject Specialist Network and is a committee member of the Plastics Historical Society. Previously, she worked at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where she was keeper of the Word and Image Department and head of contemporary programmes. Susan and the MODIP team have organised a large number of exhibitions that demonstrate the contribution of plastics in the 20th and 21st centuries. As Professor Hunt said earlier, the university has just hosted a very successful conference organised by MODIP called Provocative Plastics. And the conference attracted an international audience consisting of academics, industrialists, campaigners, artists and scientists, a mix of people that I think exemplifies the influential position of plastics in our society. Now, Susan's introduction to the exhibition catalogue references Paul Clay's statement that art makes visible. I would like to open our discussion by considering the process of making visible. With the assistance of the museum's curators and the creative vision of the artist, humble plastic objects have been on a journey of elevation, even deification. In taking the ketchup bottle from the cafe table into the hallowed setting of the gallery, it has been brought from darkness, literally from a store box, I think, into the artificial light of the photographer's studio. So hopefully we can open up this making visible process by asking Susan about the start of the journey of elevation. From a curatorial point of view, why plastics and why choose one object over another. And then Mariele will describe her inspiration and the techniques she's used in making these humble plastic objects worthy of our attention, and maybe a little bit about how the exhibition relates to her personal practice. And then I think Anita will will focus very briefly on the relationship between the gallery and the museum. So then we'll open the floor to the audience, and so you can sort of, discuss your ideas or explore anything that the panellists mentioned a little bit further. So thank you. So Susan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kavita. You ask why plastics, which is a question I'm frequently asked. I think people are surprised to find plastics as a focus for a museum because it's at odds with the popular idea of what a museum is about. The word museum comes from the Greek museon, and that means a temple or shrine of the muses, and thus we tend to think of museums as places where you get inspiration, and by extension that it's full of things that are beautiful and or rare, things that are from far away, or things that we're not familiar with. Mainly things that are precious and valuable. By contrast, plastics are all around us and thus associated with the everyday. They can be beautiful, they can even be rare, but mainly they're so familiar that they're almost invisible. We seldom give them a second thought. There's also the tricky question of authenticity. People expect to see things that are authentic in museums. But really one of the really glorious things about plastics is that they can be used to copy or to imitate very convincingly materials that are often much more valuable than they are. And another way for describing that activity is faking. And frankly, you don't expect to go to a museum and see fakes. However, also crucial to the question why plastics in terms of a museum is the role of museums as they're perceived today, and they are no longer seen as cabinets of curiosity, but rather, to quote from the International Council for Museums definition, institutions which acquire, conserve, research, communicate and exhibit the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study and enjoyment. And, self-evidently, plastic things are part of that heritage. Indeed, now more things are made of plastics and more types of things are made of plastics than any other material group. So looked at one way, if plastics are not collected by museums, much of our heritage will be lost. Therefore, it's really rather strange that more plastics aren't found in museums, in museum collections than there are. I personally became interested in plastics when, in another life, in the 1990s, I was organising the V&A's first global 20th century gallery. Now, the V&A is a museum of high rather than high street design. However, during the 20th century, designers more and more focused on high street design, and a huge number of the things you can buy in the high street are made of plastics. So my dilemma was, how on earth do you do justice to what designers did in that century in a collection of high design which included very, very few plastic things? As a result, I was given a budget to go shopping for plastic things, and my interest in plastics was sparked. So when in 2006 I was invited to come here to the Arts University Bournemouth and look at what was then known as the Design Collection Museum's collection, it was easy for me to appreciate the real significance of what the colleagues there had been doing, which was to create a website that brought together a number of plastic collections, the plastic objects from their own collection, but also from the Bakelite Museum, from a collection in America, and also from the Plastics Historical Society, and we now have their collection here on long-term loan. And so one of the recommendations I made for the future was that the Museum of Design, the Design Collection Museum could turn into a museum of design in plastics, and that had the unique selling point that there wasn't then, and there still isn't, another accredited museum in this country with a focus on plastics. And so that was actually what the management of the university decided to go with. So in 2007, the Design Collection Museum changed its name to what we now call MODIP. As a museum and a specialist university of the arts, MODIP has two roles. One is the one that fits in with the definition of ICON that I explained. That's researching and communicating the contribution of plastics to our heritage. but the other is to explore the value of objects in teaching and learning, and especially in the creative environment. With the latter role in mind, although we'd done lots of exhibitions about the role of plastics, we decided we wanted to work with an artist in order to help to demonstrate the creative potential of the objects, really for our own students, to try to open hearts and minds to different ways of engaging with the collection. We chose to work with Mariele in particular because she, partly as Kavita said, she's an artist who works in lots of media, and we didn't want to say that we wanted an artist working in a particular media, so we didn't know at all what she would produce. On the other hand, we knew she was someone whose a common factor in her art was the intensification of looking and seeing. And we gave her really a very open brief. It was simply to, as part of her residency here, to come in and look at the collection and to then represent it in a way that would enable people to see the collection afresh. And I hope you will agree with me that she's done that absolutely magnificently. So just before I hand over to her for her to explain about her work and how Plastic Vanitas fits into her work more broadly, I would just like to tell you about a sort of complementary challenge that we have going. It's called the Plastic Vanitas Photographic Challenge, and it's asking people to create their own still lifes out of plastic things that they gather. They can be things they find in their own home, or it can be stuff that they pick up by the seaside as they're going for a walk in the park or whatever. But we want people to create their own still lives, photographic still lives, title them, or to explain to them the point of view, explain the point of view from which they're coming, and to load them on the Plastic Vanitas website. On that website you can find out how to enter, and there are lots of these postcards around in the exhibition and on campus. And I'd be very grateful if people here would encourage their students to rise to this challenge. That's all then that I want to say, so I'll now hand over to the artist Mariele Neudecker, and I would like to thank her very, very much for fulfilling the brief so brilliantly.
Oh, thank you. I suppose this is the moment to really send a big thank you back to not only you, the whole team and Modip staff, and they're here somewhere, they're moving. I have done quite a few residencies, but this was incredibly special in a way because I felt really out of my comfort zone in some places. I've never really worked in a photographic studio before, and it just really shifted something within my practice that maybe if I'll show you some images in a second, but sort of was on the line, but it was a really good opportunity, and a really I kind of understood the word residency now as a whole different thing, and it really was great. Thank you. So I shall try. This is good. This is the challenge. 5 minutes or 7 minutes. I don't know how long I have to contextualize what I've done within the sort of longer timeline of what I've done before, and certainly to sort of embed it in looking at landscape mainly most of the time. However, looking for plastic was very easy. I have worked a lot with plastics in different ways. Something I've never really, that was the last thing on my mind. I was surprised. So yeah, you work with plastic. Would you, when I got the invitation, I haven't really even understood that I work with plastic rather lots. So I've started off with an image obviously here to sort of hover from the Still Life series, but I'll take you through a very odd, maybe slightly chaotic sort of whistle-stop journey through my practice. I felt initially I'll show you just some of the paintings that would have informed my... Is there any chance to have that light not in my face? Thank you. Paintings I would have looked at when I made a whole sort of bundle of works, sort of for the tank works, if you like to call them. There'll be a few of them coming up in a minute, where I really looked at how we frame images, not necessarily just paintings, also photographs, how the crop and the framing is sort of something that opens up a whole other world. I suppose as a student I was sort of getting slightly obsessed with this sort of weighing up if I'm a sculptor or painter. I started as a painter, and somehow this sort of whole notion of painting bringing another world to you that could be completely fictional, of course, and sculpture being the real thing in front of you, sort of landing from another planet, and the sort of whole interpretation of images. So I started making sculptures based on paintings. This would have been just after I left college, and after also doing a lot of trips around the museums in Europe, and being particularly intrigued by the sublime, and in this case the use of fogs and mists to sort of diffuse and disguise some of the landscapes and the horizons. So I was really keen to unravel a sense of timeline within those spaces, where I would look at past, present, future timelines as a sort of foreground, midground, background idea, but very much with the cropped image in mind. Usually, or always I should say, all these tanks have an element of human evidence, be it a path, be it a cairn, be it a cross on a mountain or things like that. So there is always, if it wasn't the framing, there would be a little path or tunnel or something that would declare this space as an inhabited, cultured landscape rather than a wild bit of nature. The question of sort of that is a bigger one. I probably can't even begin to go into that, to do with looking for wilderness, or at what point there could possibly be a wilderness, but I'll touch upon that maybe with this sort of snippet of Arctic work. This piece was, it's all plastic, by the way. All these pieces in water are made of fiberglass. This was made when I had the Henry Moore Fellowship at Spike Island and could work with the entire space that Spike had to offer. It's changed since then, but I was really keen to find a detail in a painting and make it a really grand, big statement, sort of have the background, the mountain range in the background of a painting as the main subject of this experience, where you could circumnavigate the tank, you could go upstairs, you could sort of investigate different angles and so on. I have to keep moving quite fast, sorry. At one point I was decided to think of a permanent installation in a museum in Japan. This is all made of plastic. It was kind of pushing myself to a point of almost ridiculous, meticulous detail of making plastic pine cones, plastic everything. I felt it was really important to maintain that level of detail and almost hyper-real detail, to not slip into a sort of other land of theatre and backdrop and stage set, even though of course there is a sort of element of theatre in there with the one light source, etc. So it's life-size, cast from trees, as you can see in the top left. Plenty of rubber and plastic temporarily in the forest. All the trees survived, we just sort of took molds. And anyway, I have stopped making tanks until I sort of had another phase of making these spherical tanks, where I was really more interested as well how the water distorts in the sphere. With the other tanks, the distortion of what you see is sort of doing a lot that these images don't really capture, but it kind of shifts and moves in size and scale quite a lot as you move around. This additionally inverts everything, so when people walk around these pieces, they animate the scene and they would walk upside down, hence this whole landscape is upside down. Also, fairly recently, I was invited to show work in the Architecture Biennale in conversation with the architects who made the Halley 6 research station in Antarctica. This was for me a really sort of quite a big shift to sort of use as a source a real piece of architecture for a piece, rather than a sort of fictional painting or maybe a sort of found photo that could be anywhere. This is a very specific place. I worked with the architect's drawings to make the sort of 3D model and get it computer generated and so on. So there was a different sense of reality in this piece. Somehow, because nobody would necessarily, well, very few people go and see this in Antarctica. There is a sort of interest in this fiction of the place that not even the architect has been to. Is it, you know, the sort of levels of reality were really interesting for me. Anyway, I'm sorry about these images. This is sort of last minute decision, but I felt maybe that would add another angle to sort of the use of plastic string as light. This is fluorescent fishing string. There's something ridiculous like 17,000 strings making up these shards of light. Again, that actually was probably the first time I had a whole loads of students helped me as a sort of interns in a similar way that I really enjoyed working with them here on the residency. But this was such a labour-intensive piece, recreating an image where the implication is that the light comes through the windows and hits the floor. Sounded so simple when I started. Anyway, just different uses of plastic. I'm going to really race through this because I'm aware that this is not really the point of the conversation. A stereolithography piece that at that point in 2000 was the largest possible piece you could have made in one of those machines, that now probably every school has one of these. Computer-generated stretched Holbein skull. I was really keen to use that sort of really complex bone structure in a computer process to recreate 62 centimeters long. I measured it on the painting, sort of replica of the implied 3D distorted skull in the Ambassador painting. Which you could, that could be almost called the Vanitas painting, the Ambassadors. I'm sure everybody knows the one I'm talking about. Once I had a sort of long stretch where I didn't work with water and landscape and sort of worked much more with the sort of contrast of moving image video, the reality of the film and the reality of a model where you have different vistas through gaps in the architecture to see the films, and sort of playing with different notions of reality based on the Hammershøi paintings. I'm just throwing snippets at you. I know it's maybe not entirely fair to do this, but hey. This image I kind of kept in because I did a whole body of work to do with the Arctic, and having gone to Greenland twice by now, and spending time that particular trip with subsistence hunters that live very much like they would have lived 4,000 years ago, with some exceptions, and one of the exceptions is plastic. They use the skins, they use the blades are still held in bone. Everything is sort of very, very much like in the museum, but on the ice, for real. But they use, for example, plastic under the hoofs of under the sleds, where they used to have metal. Now this is an old one. The only difference is the plastic under the sled, for example, or that they do have mobile phones, but they don't get reception, so it's kind of all that sort of weird bits of plastic flying around the Arctic. You can see a green strip of plastic up on that sled. They teach them at school to do it and how to do it, how to build a sled. I was sort of going through hundreds of images just looking for plastic. I suppose I just felt that was really quite an interesting, odd place where I found plastic in a different use. How they get hold of it, I don't know. But I spent a month up there sort of learning a lot about how they hunt and all that stuff. But anyway, one of the pieces I made coming back was a sculpture relating back to architecture, making a big slice of an iceberg that fits precisely through a particular door in a museum. It had to become architectural in some way because I had no opportunity to put a path or any detail like that on something on that scale. I was quite surprised how much that has moved around in different contexts. But that's probably one of the bigger pieces of plastic sculpture I have made. Very briefly, I think the conversation with plastics and the oceans will reoccur and is difficult to not have. I've worked for quite a few years by now with Alex Rogers in Oxford on his research to do with deep ocean seabed research and map making and so on. But we talk a lot about plastic in the oceans, and I made a set of, there's probably altogether 9 videos, but I focused on looking at the plastic that gets sort of dumped under the sea, be it nettings or lobster pots or gloves or all sorts of plastic that people throw from the ships and think disappears, but it obviously doesn't. So my whole interest with the oceans is a lot to do with that invisibility and making visible, and how they kind of just very, the films that get taken, they're so limited, obviously, because they're only sort of mowing for the maps here and there. So the implication is massive of what they already find on those scratch lines that they film. So I'm really interested in the gaps between the films and all that sort of thing. That's just one of the pieces. I will not even go into it. The last piece that isn't built yet, but hopefully will be built because it's a very long-term project, is to do with the tidal lagoon up in Swansea Bay. I've been selected for this, but it's a big fundraising moment at the minute. They're getting planning permissions and everything, but I will attempt to build a very large plastic cast of the moon in the most realistic possible way, where the surface of the moon is sort of based on 3D NASA files, and any view through lenses, through telescopes or camera lenses, will give you a sense of familiarity in terms of that surface, because it's so accurate and so detailed. So I'm sort of back a little bit to that forest, where it's just an insane amount of detail that takes it away from what possibly that sculpture on that size would imply, but to make it just the most ridiculous detailed moon surface. That's the plan anyway. It'll also be a sort of venue and so on, and I haven't really got enough time to go into that. I could probably talk about that one for another 10 minutes, but just sort of because it opens up the whole different scale of architecture in plastic and so on. But back to the exhibition. I've just got another 4 or 5 slides now, sorry. I've obviously at one point made the decision, in discussion also with Susan, to sort of, when I was invited, I came down to see the collection, and I think one of the things that baffled me was how the collection was organised, first of all, wasn't it? And I thought, how do I go about this? What can I do with this? This is an overwhelming amount of bits of plastic. The fact that the weight of the plastic seemed to sort of have a great influence how the boxes are organised in terms of the shelves was very fascinating, because it sort of grouped it in odd combinations. You had light plastics, heavy plastics at the bottom, light plastics at the top, everything in between. Sometimes the boxes were very thematic, sometimes they really weren't. So in a way, that kind of, there was a reminiscence of some of this slight chaos on these Vanitas tables, where you sort of get representations of wealth and decay and all sorts of things kind of pushed together in that kind of beautiful, amazing way, where it was quite soon, I think, that I said I want to make these into Vanitas paintings, because there is that would then be a sort of common thread through all these objects, that then even the least meaningful ones would suddenly gain significance because they are in the context of that scene in a still life. So off we went and organised. First of all, I had access to all the sort of, well, Pam was incredibly helpful with pointing me into the right direction for the boxes, because I gave her a big list of objects that are likely to be in a Vanitas painting, such as an instrument or a flowers, fruit, skulls. There wasn't a skull or a globe, which kind of was a little bit surprising and frustrating, but I found lots of replacements for those. Anyway, so it was just this sort of wonderful process to then learn about how the studio can be used and how they transform in the lens, in the frame, with that light. First I thought I'd use candles and long exposures, but actually what ended up happening was fussing a lot with lamps that would just flash for a split second for the image. So I think we had maybe 2 or 3 long exposures to try, but it all was quite odd because it looked so mundane and quite boring, to be honest, outside of the shot. And there was about 80 shots per frame, per image, to sort of get to the point that I was happy with the composition and the light and the whole lot. So this is just to give you some sense of the studio, and then just some images, but I assume you've all seen the exhibition. And there is the animation that gives some indication of the fussing around with little shifts and shuffles. But I think I infected a bunch of maybe 6 or 7 students that helped me with this sort of obsession of kind of doing this. This sort of tiny little, no you can't, no. And that was just really fun. It was such a weird thing because every box, there was different rules for every set of things really, apart from the basics that I allowed to have wooden tables and cloth. Most of the cloth was plastic, but I made allowances of the set. So, yeah, and of course there were boxes with single objects. They were relatively different or easier or maybe not, I don't know. I've sort of, through that process, obviously learned to look at Vanitas paintings differently and especially at plastic differently, and it sort of just pulled my whole interest in looking at the bigger landscape and horizons into this sort of other world, which I felt was a really good thing to do for a residency. So, and I certainly won't look at ketchup bottles ever the same way again. But it's sort of a similar thing with the landscapes as well, making the tanks. It was sort of hard to go for a walk. Who wouldn't say, oh, it's like walking through one of your tanks when the fog came out or something. So there is a sort of really close relationship to everyday life and the real thing, if there is such a thing. So this is my last slide to leave it on. Sorry, I probably spoke longer than I should have. But in the process of being in that studio and shuffling everything around for hours and hours, I don't know, there was about 6 images per day. There was a sort of point when I say, actually, when all the objects are taken away and wrapped into 2 layers of paper again, back in the box, there's something, the potential of that empty table is actually really beautiful. And the sort of, I think there was a little bit of starting the conversation about the elevated mundane object or the everyday object being elevated by coming out of the darkness, and in a way they're already elevated by being in the museum, I think, and being in that dark box, but then to sort of have the empty tables, I think, points a little bit at that sort of odd in-between stage or your imagination filling it up again, or the sort of there's something, I think, that the empty table kind of almost holds more than the full tables, because it's sort of all in your mind by then. They kind of need to be maybe in the context of the still lifes, but obviously that's a very still life too, and I'll just leave that hover there, and there we are.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a little bit more light.
I'm not sure if
maybe not right in my hand.
But not enough, yes. Is that possible? Oh, that's better. Are you happy to say a few words about the objects in the museum and gallery?
Yeah, I mean, I think where I come into this, I've actually been remarkably privileged in that I started with this project at the beginning, because in the jobs that everybody imagines are rather dull, in organising and managing art schools, you have fantastic things come across your desk all the time. And one of them was Susan and Mariele arriving to talk about how we make this project a reality. And for me, I think Mariele's just given us a fantastic demonstration of how one obsession meets another obsession. Most museums and galleries are built just on somebody's obsession, and I think there is something that's really interesting about the galleries, museums, collections that sit with institutions of making. And I think in an odd sort of way, my career over the last few years has actually been about being a custodian for a whole set of things within an organisation that come from the DNA of the organisation, the things that the subjects and the disciplines that exist. So at Wimbledon we had the theatre design archive, we had the Jocelyn Herbert archive, the letters, which included the letters between her and Beckett, designing those characters within all of the very famous Krapp's Last Tapes, everything there. When I went to the National Art School, I used to jest that I had the best art school collection ever because I had a ball and chain. It was in an old jail. But I also had the history of Australian art. I had the history of an art school because I had every artefact they used for still life, for teaching, and through that a fabulous collection of indigenous art, also the history of European teaching in a different culture. And the reason the conversation started, Mariele's a research fellow at Wimbledon. And Wimbledon met Bath. I just stepped back. That was a slip. Nothing aspirational. But in terms of what we have is a collection set about as a teaching collection from Clifford and Rosemary Ellis's time, where actually they had a complete vision for the Bath Academy of Art of a liberal arts education. So they had music, performing arts, drama, everything was actually sitting there around establishing this Academy for Art and Design with the teaching. And alongside that is a locked cupboard, and it's still a locked cupboard, and we call it our Wonder Camera, because in there it is a cabinet of curiosities. It's a set of geological finds, it's a set of natural history, it's the classic natural history collection that sat in the art schools, actually from Victorian times, but this was remade in the 1950s for Bath Academy of Art, and it sits there. We're waiting to get it out because we have all sorts of issues, because it will have arsenic, all sorts of things in it, and we've just gone through the process of conservation. I think the DNA here with your museum collection is phenomenally exciting and interesting, because the subject and the content of that is very much at the basis of our design production now. It's still this undeniable material that's everywhere around us. And bringing Mariele's obsession with the environment, with plastic, which has actually been incredibly demonstrated through this, I think is really exciting, because artists working in museums, or designers working in museums, anybody who's actually given that privileged access to a collection, to the hidden archive, if you like, and the opportunity to interrogate it through practice, examining through a very different kind of knowledge base, from systematically collecting and documenting, systematically putting things together. It's actually bringing that collision of different language, the language of making and thinking through making, which actually has a complete logic and a complete sense, and we've just watched it unfold through a very eloquent, actually, demonstration of where your work has been in very, very ambitious, very extraordinary senses. But it is that collision course, which is a dialogue. That collision course is only a dialogue about how we interrogate the world that we're in, and we can only really interrogate the world that we're in by understanding the world that's existed and exists around us. So how do we make a future? It is to develop the questioning which comes through this obsession in your instance, which is how do I understand this stuff that's everywhere? It's in Greenland, it's everywhere that you go, and then you actually re-articulate it, and I think the Swansea Bay project will be extraordinary. What I would say is, having seen this come across my desk, my vision of what might happen was completely different. I never thought this would turn into a body of photographs in the way that they have, and they're incredibly beautiful. And I watched again, I was privileged to see them being made and printed, and actually seeing them being realised is akin to something which is about that whole thing of seeing the world anew, the way that somebody's very focused attention and attentiveness to detail can allow us to see our worlds differently and to gauge our experience of things differently. I think I'll probably stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience? There's a huge amount of material for us to think about. But over to you. Anything that you'd like to ask our panellists?
Marielle, I was fascinated by the fact that your landscapes, you said there were elements of humanity within them, because they do look a little like wastelands. They're almost, they seem to be, in the case of David Friedrich, a kind of, a world apart. So, what are those things of humanity in them?
Well, the residues of human residues, I should say, but not human remains. I also decided, I think one of the first times I had little train set people in there, but they just kind of, I kind of got rid of them very quickly. There's never a person in there. However, you'll find evidence that this landscape has been visited, or there is a path, or there is a cairn, or there is very clearly, and I'm interested in making it a landscape rather than just a piece of wilderness. Because why? Yeah, because it doesn't really exist, I don't think. And in a way, I always sort of was interested, and I'm still interested in this sort of notion of escaping into another space. And in a way, if you look at the Caspar David Friedrich paintings where it all started, there is always this invitation to sort of this, very often the turned figure, this Rückenfigur where you swap places and you see more than the frame allows. And in a way I was really keen to capture that somehow, to allow the imagination to sort of enter the space and be in it, and then it becomes much bigger. And the water already makes it much bigger.
So Rückenfigur is almost always there, isn't it?
The Rückenfigur seems to be always there, and even if it's not there, you start seeing it. It's kind of you enter the space.
So there's a presence in the house.
And then the horizon line in the painting sort of opens up to a different space. And in a way, it was that sparked off the whole idea of the tank, because the distortion of size in the water is doing something like that, where it does but two things. The glass in the water it sort of expands space and shrinks it at the same time. It's a very odd animation of a very confined bit of space.
I don't know how you've done it, but I think you have done the same thing in your photographs, of having a presence and absence of humanity at the same time. And it kind of works brilliantly for the Vanitas element of it, because that person, you're sort of seeing something where somebody has been, potentially, and then it's just absent at the moment.
Yeah, and it's in a way, sort of looking at them now I mean, it's not a long hindsight, but just sort of, obviously I've kind of done them, and it's a sort of group of images, and in a way that group of images has become very much a group of a sort of museal group of images to me, the way I've hung them and everything. This sort of connection to painting really sort of seemed to connect the landscapes more than I thought, actually, even going through to sort of the Hammershøi paintings and maybe the skull as well. There was always a sort of hint at exactly that with the landscapes, that the landscape elements are sort of metaphorically understood, or that they interpret some kind of human psychology, which obviously Vanitas does anyway. So it just seems to sort of pull out the human aspect in landscape even more. It's like there's so many, you can interpret the landscapes very clearly. It's as if you have a sort of, whatever, you have the big Arctic seascape, the ship stuck in the ice, they are clearly Friedrich's kind of classic, sort of semi-apocalyptic kind of images. And in a way that's interesting to sort of carry through to something like a still life. I've taken photos of sort of, there's still lifes in landscapes everywhere, I think, as well, where you have human, whatever, you have the flag on top of the hill. It's not ever still, but then these still lifes are not really ever still.
Well, the landscape is a sort of still.
Any other questions or thoughts?
I wanted to ask Marielle, with the fiberglass, what is the sort of process you go through to get the sort of end product? Like, do you work with like a mould first?
It goes both ways. The early pieces were all sort of single modelled up casts in plaster. The plaster got then destroyed. The more time went on, I sort of decided to make some into editions, and they would be rubber casts and then recast, or at least I would keep the rubber mould. But it's just it's a really straightforward casting process, modelling up in clay, taking a mould, and then that sort of varied more than anything. Occasionally I would have worked in negative. Depends what it is. Different things. Depends on the scale.
Sorry, with this exhibition, these photographs using plastic objects in the museum, did you have an idea before you started how you wanted those objects to look, or things that they might represent?
I couldn't really, because I worked in sort of 4 blocks of 3 days, and I came with, there were lists of numbers everywhere, but I often didn't even know which box we were going to do or something on the day. Sometimes there was a bit, can we have that helmet tomorrow? No, basically every box required a whole different sort of take on it, on what there was, and often it changed a lot. And some of the animated film there in the exhibition illustrates that quite well, how things are shuffling, but some of it shuffled quite dramatically, and I would just kind of get rid of cloth and change the light completely, or I just literally did it as I did it. There wasn't really a huge amount of planning, but I surrounded myself with Vanitas paintings, and obviously I kind of knew what I was after, but there was very little space for planning, and I don't think you can. How would you plan it? You'd have to do it to plan it, so it was just sort of all went through, and it was possible really through, also it would have taken forever without the help, so I had usually 2 helpers with unwrapping all the objects, and then making choices and decisions, sort of looking at all the unwrapped objects there and then, and just get on with it that way. And sometimes that could take hours, and sometimes it was really obvious. It kind of, not sure if that answers anything.
I can really relate to the sort of looking at it for a long time and it's like moving it slightly, moving it back again. How did you really know when it was right? Were you not tempted to just take loads and loads of photos?
I took loads and loads of photos. This is about 80 photos per shot. Yeah, I was very tempted to. There was no way to do it any other way, because it was really. It took a little while to usually find the right frame and angle of the table, and do where is the cloth, if there's a cloth, and where is the edge of the table. Once that was sort of there, then it would take loads of shots to sort of make other. Yeah, no, it was very much sort of evolving, and in a way, yeah, it was usually about 60, 70, 80 sometimes photographs. Slightly mad. I think Anita's absolutely right, I'm obsessed.
You didn't realise until now.
It was sometimes so ridiculous when I can't quite say why they worked there was a point when I think it was about the 3rd image with the flasks, the sort of quite pastel-y weird colours. Anyway, there's one image where I thought, this makes sense, I'm going for it now, and then I did 60 boxes.
No, I know you are obsessed.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone has obsessions.
Well, no, because every single one was so different in a way. It just was difficult to stop.
Can I ask you about the way the exhibition's being hung? I think that's really interesting, because there are a lot of images as well.
Yeah, I mean, there was obviously a point when the shots were there, and I'm not even sure how that conversation started, but I knew I wanted them obviously to sort of be in the world of canvases and paintings, and I fairly quickly, I think, decided to do a museum hang, and this goes back to sort of halfway through the process or something. No, we haven't.
I think we liked having both the sort of traditional way of hanging paintings combined with actually the sort of modern sparse gallery hang. I think we were trying to make some sort of statement.
Well, there wasn't quite enough images to do the full-blown Academy hang everywhere on all the walls, and in a way it's also interesting to maybe, you can only learn or see by actually doing it, to sort of have something that out was making sense. And particularly the really tiny ones, I didn't want them to sort of all disappear in a wall. Yeah, it was sort of, obviously, by the time they all went off to the framers, it was clear what was going to happen, roughly. And then it was a very intuitive kind of thing to lay them out on the floor and do it on the installation day, really. There wasn't any other way of... I spent quite a lot of time trying to get the right frame for the right image.
And there are both old and new frames, aren't there?
Yeah, which initially I didn't think I should or could do, but I'm really glad I did. I thought they all had to be new frames, but yeah, no, I'm really keen on the old frames as well.
I think they work really, really well.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? On the wall where you've got the salon hang, is there a reason why you painted it grey, or was it grey before you hung?
Well, I now would probably, on behalf of what I'm seeing here, I would do everything in grey. I think the grey, I knew, well, just looking at museums, that they often hang on colour, be it green or red or grey, and the sort of, it was just a sort of process of kind of looking around what would make sense, because some of them are really colourful, some of them are really black, but I just felt grey was a good colour to hold it together, and I think it does make them more punchy, and I would certainly hang them all on grey, I think, if I can. I think the white is a bit of a sort of, it's too white, but it's looking at museums and the museum wall colours and somehow making that decision that they're going to go for that grey. And it was quite interesting. I spent the last 2 days in Frieze Masters. Frieze Masters is entirely grey. The whole tent is grey. And there was only two booths in the Frieze tent that were grey. And they are the much more relaxing spaces where you can actually see properly. Everything else is so... I've developed a sort of real thing about grey walls.
Well, they allow you to see a tonal register, so it allows both colour to float and...
Yeah.
So will we have more grey walls?
More grey walls everywhere. It'll be all grey by the end it comes to pool.
Okay, caution court's going to be a challenge.
Well...
Maybe you're upstairs.
Well, we'll have a look, but I'm glad the wall is grey. Let's leave it.
Can I say something else?
Yeah.
I was quite surprised when you said that for you it's a lot about landscape, the way the images are, because for me it was more about memory, and because the objects are so familiar, everyone can relate to them, so then it's got very strong psychological connections.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, but then you could say that about the landscapes. I've often depicted landscapes that are really familiar from paintings, that are part of a sort of cultural consciousness and so on. They are familiar landscapes, even if it's unrecallable now as a sort of familiar view onto mountains from a plane. That's familiar to most people by now. Totally, I agree. It's to do with that, and I think we did mention as well. Well, this sort of whole thing of everyday objects, and some of them are really not very valuable objects, and how they get sort of elevated and put into different contexts, and they become these valuable objects of references that maybe you would never think of. So it kind of changes your outlook and your experience of them in an everyday situation completely.
But one of the things they also do is capture time and talk about a temporal...
Yeah.
They refer to a temporal being or a temporal presence,
Yeah.
even though they are objects saved for the museum and saved for the future. So there is that memento mori element of it is something we haven't perhaps talked about very much within the conversation.
Yes, and they're not all yogurt pots. Obviously, there's some really valuable, beautiful things. You know, that was really exciting as well to sort of open those very precious boxes. There was definitely, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 10 really precious boxes that were needing special treatment because they were so valuable and unusual objects in there.
Well, they're unusual, but I don't think just in terms of monetary value, any of them compares with what you would normally or often find in museums. But you have given them completely new lives. It's interesting to talk about it being memory, because for me it isn't so much memory, it's more to do with them being completely transformed in their relationships.
It's perception, and in a way that's what, in my mind, connects up with the landscape perception, or our perception generally, how we perceive, and that sort of also was the subtitle of that conference in a way, sort of how, what was the line again? With the
your position dictates what you see.
It's exactly that, but I could probably find examples all through that slide talk I just showed you, all these different things. It's that's what ties it together, and not necessarily because of memory, but also that, I think, or experience, sort of you're projecting onto landscapes, you're projecting onto those objects, and of course they're all fleeting by. Fleeting moments.
Sorry, I was just going to say where memory, I think, comes in is the fact that you remember those objects from your own childhood or your own experience. So I don't know if that's what you were suggesting, but those objects have memories contained within them for the individual viewer.
I remember that
some
as the most
exceptions.
commonly said thing when people come into our normal exhibitions. I mean, we hear it every day.
Yeah, I remember that.
But of course,
Nostalgia.
you don't remember them in the way that they're shown. So when we looked at the first slide, the Carmen rollers are the sort of emblem of worldly vanity, aren't they? But when they're on the dressing table in the bedsit, they're something completely different. It's that transposition which is why this show is totally beguiling. It is a special world of stillness and provocation, which of course is what so much of Dutch painting of that period was. It was showing objects which, generally speaking, had not been encountered. The pineapple, was like, what is that? Because it wasn't in, a sort of popular usage, was it? It was about mysteries.
And the wilting tulip,
Yes.
which was so valuable at that point.
Yeah.
Wasn't it one of the most valuable things ever? A tulip. And then they'd be sort of hanging off the table.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're all very personal items as well, aren't they? In those Vanitas paintings, they belong to whoever the person was that the painting has been commissioned for. They're actually possessions of theirs.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of ownership about it for the person who has that painting in their house. Those are my things. That's what I may come to in life. So there's something slightly different with this in that the presence of those objects are ubiquitous. They're things that they belong within that collection. They don't belong to an individual. They sort of somehow take on the presence of an individual.
Well, most of them would have belonged to somebody, of course.
Yeah.
Individual.
It's the reversal of objects of value, isn't it? That these are not really objects of value which you've transformed into value. It's, I think it's all the mysteries. I like it because this is Caspar David Friedrich is a mystery, the bourne from which no traveller returns. It's that.
One more question, and unfortunately we have to go.
Instead of a question what I comment myself, but personally what I found most interesting about the whole exhibition piece is the rather controversial contrast between the idea of the beauty of decay, which is usually the central theme in Vanitas over the last couple of centuries in paintings, that you show something that is, like for example fruits which are decaying, which are going to be gone, which are held in this certain image which still will survive over the centuries, or it's at least meant to be. And in the photographs here, the objects themselves, which are not there to decay, which are meant to last for a very long time, and that's actually the central problem about plastic, that it's not going to decay, or let's say very, very slow. Often considered as to be trash, nothing of a great value, and that's what I find most interesting, that you've chosen the name Plastic Vanitas, which is for me a huge contrast, like two words that wouldn't really fit together in my opinion. But the outcomes are really great. I really like that.
Thank you. That's a very good note to end on, isn't
It
it?
is.
It's yeah.
Well, on behalf of everybody, thank you so much to our panellists. Thank you, Mariele, Susan and Anita. It's been really interesting.